having a conversation between John Booth, who is on the education group, and he's going to formally introduce proceedings. There will be time for people to ask questions after John and Ilan have had a conversation, but we would like to ask you to make sure that your questions are brief and to the point, and that we don't use the chat for questions, because with so many people here, the chat is a distraction and confusing. So we look forward to a wonderful evening of discussion and debate. And I hand over now formally to John Booth. I should say, sorry, just before I hand over to John, I should say the whole meeting is going to be recorded. So I hope you'll be happy with that. If you're not, it's probably best not to ask a question. Okay, thank you. John.
Thank you, Mickey, and welcome to everybody here, and particularly to those people who are attending a JVL event first time. We're very happy to see you here in such distressing times that we're living through. I'm a non-Jewish member, support member of JVL, and have been since its formation in 2017. And previous to that, as a journalist, had been writing about the so-called war on terror and saw the Labour anti-Semitism crisis to some extent as an extension of that which we'd been living through for several decades. And I was happy to join that, and for a number of years have been a member of the Education Group. And in that capacity, I'm very happy to welcome Ilan. It's often said on these occasions, this is someone who needs no introduction. So we'll be brief, and I put in the notes accompanying the link to the biography, a short biography of Ilan, and also an introduction to his splendid book, which will form the basis of some of our conversation tonight. So welcome, we're glad to see you here.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you.
Can't see Ilan.
You can't see me?
No, well, not at the top of the screen.
Can you see me, John?
Yes, I can.
Sorry, carry on then.
Okay.
We've not got a strict order of business for tonight until we get to the questions around 7 o'clock, but there is a rough schema that Ilan and I have agreed, covering some of the elements of his book, which is big, over 500 pages and lots of footnotes, and also other subjects which Ilan, on occasion like this, may choose to the opportunity of speaking about. But I wonder, Ilan, for starters, for those who may be new to some of this area, if you could just give us a brief contextual chronology of British involvement in the part of the world we call the Middle East, and which most of the rest of the world calls West Asia, and how we came to be involved in that and why it should be a concern for those on the left now.
Yes, John, I will try and do it. I just get a lot of messages. Maybe the administrator can help if whoever runs it can spotlight me, because some of the people cannot see it, some can. So, but I'll continue, and hopefully this will be somewhat mended. Yes, the involvement of Britain with Palestine goes through or underwent through certain phases. There is a phase that I would like to call the religious phase. This is when, from a political imperial strategic view, Britain is not interested in Palestine as part of a future empire. This is roughly the period between the beginning of the 18th century, I would say, up to the end of the 19th century. In those 200 years, between 700 and 1900, roughly, the people who are really interested in Britain, in acquiring Palestine, or envisaging a Palestine that might be one day part of the British Empire, in brackets, I know that most of you remember that at that time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire that ruled Palestine from 1517 to 1917. So in those years, in that 200 years when Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire, the group that was interested in Palestine or looked at Palestine as a future part of British rule was a stream of evangelical Christianity within Britain that had a parallel group in the United States. Probably the most notable person among them, known to quite a lot of people, is Lord Shaftesbury, who was very active in advocating for a British Palestine already in the 1840s. But there were people before him and after him, pundits, literati, but mostly very pious evangelical Christians who believed that Britain has a role not only in being the power in Palestine, but that which is much more, what is more important for our case, they believe that part of the historical rule Britain should fulfill is to what they would call to restore the Jews to Palestine. Therefore, they, in many ways, they are called the restorationist movement. They believe that the so-called return of the Jews to Palestine after 2,000 years of exile would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the beginning of the end of time. It would be part of a divine scheme that you, as a British Empire, can actually contribute to accelerate and to advance and to make sure that it is implemented even earlier or rather sooner than later. So that was the beginning. And the formative period begins in the very early 20th century and ends with the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This is when other groups, Jews and non-Jews, in Britain and outside of Britain, begin to envisage a British Palestine that is also a Jewish Palestine, but not only for theological reasons. This is when already there is a strong lobby inside Britain that believes that the Ottoman Empire has come to an end and Britain should be first to take over the possessions of the empire, the Ottoman Empire, before other European powers get hold of them. And this is also the time when Jewish activists from the mid-19th century, and especially towards the end of the 19th century, begin to see the colonization of Palestine or building a Jewish state in Palestine as a remedy for anti-Semitism and also for the traditionalism of Judaism. They want to redefine Judaism as nationalism. They are looking for the romantic version of nationalism, and therefore they're also looking for a homeland, and they prefer Palestine to be that homeland. The moment these two other groups, the imperialists, who are not necessarily religious, and the activists on the Jewish side who believe in what became known as Zionism, align themselves to the Christian Zionists, who were actually the first one to bring forward the idea or to put forward the idea of a Jewish Palestine. The moment they're aligned together, they become a very important driving force behind the decision-making in Britain before the First World War and during the First World War. And it took some time to persuade the most important policymakers in Britain that Palestine, A, is a strategic asset, and Palestine was not a strategic asset compared to Egypt, Iraq, or the Arabian Peninsula, and that the best way to serve the interests of the empire is to make sure that Palestine is also a Jewish British Palestine, or an Anglo-Jewish Palestine. You may all remember Lawrence of Arabia. He was part of a different lobby, a lobby that believed that actually an Arab Palestine connected to the Hashemites that now rule Jordan is a far better arrangement that would serve much better the British national interest or imperial interest in the Middle East. So these are the foundation of the movement that begin with Christian Zionism and then building an alliance in which Zionism caters for different interests, sometimes contradictory interests, but together they fuse into a powerful lobby behind the one power that has the ability to decide the future of Palestine immediately after the First World War.
Thanks for that, Ilan. I live in Scotland, and down the road from where I am, I wake up every morning looking at the spire of the church where Gordon Brown's father imbued his sons with an affection for Zionism. And I thought it might help to tie this Christian dimension to Labour politics if I just quote what you've said in your book. Gordon Brown was the first prime minister to go to Israel. Apparently, Her Majesty, the late Queen, refused to go to Israel, but Gordon Brown went and addressed the Knesset in 2008. And this is what he said. My hometown, where I grew up not long after your independence in 1948, is the small industrial town of Kirkcaldy on the eastern coast of Scotland. Kirkcaldy is 2,000 miles from Jerusalem, but for me, they are closely linked, not in their landscapes and certainly not their weather, but in the profound impact of your early statehood years on my childhood. My father was a minister of the church who learned Hebrew and had a deep and lifelong affection for Israel. For 3 decades, he was a member and again chairman of the Church of Scotland's Israel Committee, and he traveled back and forth to Israel twice every year, often more. After each trip, he would roll out the old film projector, plug it in and load the film. More often than not, the projector would break down, but he would always get it back up and running. And I will never forget those early images of your home in my home and the stories my father would tell. He promised the Knesset that the next generation of his family would continue in the same vein. He said to the Knesset, my sons are still young children. They are just 2 and 4. They have not yet made that journey to Jerusalem made by their grandfather and then his sons. But one day I look forward to bringing them here to see what their grandfather first came to see in the early years of statehood. This indicates to me very clearly, Ilan, the link between Labour politics, which, as someone once said, owed more to Methodism than it did to Marxism, to the early days of Israel. That's your view too?
Yes, I think it's a very important feature. By the way, I don't know the sons of of him. Maybe they are members of the JVL, as far as we know. I hope his prediction turned out to be incorrect about the sons continuing the legacy of the father. But yes, it's a very important feature of policy because in the junctures in which British prime ministers or foreign ministers or cabinets have to make decisions that deviate from, let's say, a traditional British position, or are bold enough to counter the fears that usually accompany the policy making, whether by the Labour government or the Conservative government. I think the fact that you also have this kind of legacy there is another kind of blockade or another hurdle on the way of creating any or making new policies or formulating new policies towards Israel and Palestine. These kind of immunities are particularly important when the realities on the ground are crying out for a change of policy. When it's very clear to so many other people in Britain who are not part of the policy-making elite that there needs to be a dramatic shift in British policy. I think these layers of religious beliefs or upbringing are very important. I think they were far more important until Tony Blair was elected, and including during Tony Blair's term in office. I'm not sure how much they are there today, but even in Keith Starmer's discourse, you can detect these traces as well. But definitely, in crucial moments in the life, in the history of Palestine, this was an additional factor, along with others, that determined a British policy, especially when Britain was more important than it is today, that really doomed Palestine and the Palestinians to the continued oppression, colonization, and dispossession by first the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel.
Earlier in your book, you talk about the making of the Labour Friends of Israel, and it came as a surprise to me, at least in ignorance, that two of the formative figures in the 50s, soon after the creation of the State of Israel, were Anarin Bevan and his wife, Jenny Lee, about whom a new play has been written.
That's right.
How did that come about, Ilan? What was the logic that took two socialist heroes from many people into that position?
I think there were two factors which were very important. One, and we have to admit it, the traditional left, including in Britain, especially left that was institutionalized in respectful kind of opposition parties that had a chance to even to govern, namely not more marginal groups on the left, but the real, whether it's, we can call it the social democratic parties, whether it's a Democratic Party in the United States, the SPD in Western Germany and later Germany, and of course the Labour Party in Britain. That in those years, in that and we're talking about the 1950s and the early 1960s, the parties were racist. They hid their racism better than the conservatives. There's no doubt about it, because they were subscribing to universal values that should have been against racism. But they were, including, by the way, the established communist parties in Europe were also racist. And because that was the era, that was the period. It took time to overcome centuries of racism and supremacist attitudes, even if you did not subscribe to supremacist and racist ideology per se. And so that was one reason that if you had a situation like in Palestine, historical Palestine, who do you prefer? Those who claim to be the socialists of the Zionist state, or those who claim to be a socialist of the Palestinian people, who in those days didn't even yet have a proper liberation movement to speak about. When that was the choice, you go for the European Jews in Palestine. They seem more familiar, they seem less alien, and you don't have the same kind of racism toward them as you have towards anyone who was an Arab. So that's one reason that they were blind to the fact that the claims for socialism, for trade unionism, for protecting workers' rights in Israel in the 1950s and early 60s, the Jenny Lee writes in her reports, and she's so impressed by that. And especially she was impressed by the kibbutz, the collective Jewish settlement, that they were totally blind for the fact that the Palestinian population in Israel was living under military rule, a ruthless, callous military rule, and that the kibbutzim that she visited were built on the ruins of Palestinian villages that were dispossessed by Israel in 1948. This is one reason. The certain reason, and a second reason, and I bring it in the book, Israel was already very, very involved in lobbying, in advocacy, in the trade unions and in the Labour Party. And there was no counterforce. There was no counterforce to the advocacy. There was a special unit in the Israeli general trade unions, the Histadrut, and also in the Israeli Labor Party. There was still the strongest and predominant party of Israel, whose role, the role of which was to advocate constantly for unconditional support for Israel in the TUC, in the Labour Party, among the socialist and social democratic circles of Britain. So it was hard work. They were working very hard and effectively. And therefore you had the biggest names that are associated with the left in the Labour Party actually using the Tribune up to 1967 to advocate for Israel. If you want to hear criticism on Israel in the 50s and the 60s, you hear it from some people on the right side or right wing of the Labour Party and some conservatives. Of course, things changed afterwards, but the period you're talking about when the Labour Friends of Israel was founded in the Brighton annual Labour meeting in the early 1950s, the big names on the left of the Labour Party and the center of the Labour Party were totally taken by the Israeli propaganda that they are not just supporting a Jewish state, they're supporting a Jewish social democratic state that would be a beacon for the rest of the world outside of Europe.
One of the ironies to me, looking at this particular period in the 50s, that whereas Bevan and Jenny Lee on the left of the party were supportive of Israel in this strong way, George Brown, who was on the right of the party and was married to a Jew, seemed to have quite a lot of support for Palestine and didn't see Israel in quite the same way. How do you account for that, Ilan? What was going on there?
I think that people who were not on the left of the Labour Party and therefore were not particularly taken by propaganda that said you should be admiring Israel because it's so socialist. It didn't talk to them. I think they were able much better they were in a much better place to begin to unearth some of the realities that they could see themselves when they visited the place or when they heard more objective sources telling them what was going on. And it was less to do with their being a Labour or conservative. I suppose it was a kind of a lack of any baggage or any legacy that enabled them to see the reality as it were. And in fact, if you saw the reality already then, without the filters, then you begin to understand that the Palestinians were victims already then of a project of displacement and replacement, and that actually Britain, together with other European powers, were solving a European problem of anti-Semitism through the dispossession of Palestine. But it was not easy. I remember Noam Chomsky telling us that when he was in the kibbutz in the 1950s, Hazorea, it took him time with the filters he had to understand that that particular kibbutz was built on the ruins of two Palestinian villages. This was, you needed a lot of, either to be totally blind to anything that was there before, or to overcome an ideology that began as a noble idea and to which you subscribe, namely to fight anti-Semitism and to allow the Jews to have self-determination like any other people. These were noble ideas. These were not wrong ideas. The price that the Palestinians had to pay for these European problems, and these were European solutions for European problems, took time for people to fully realize and then to articulate them in a way that made sense. And of course, already then, if you articulated criticism like that, you would already then be immediately accused of anti-Semitism. It was already weaponized then. as a silencer of any meaningful criticism on Israel.
One of the books I've added to the invitation is this book by David Watkins, who was a fairly middle-of-the-road Labour MP during the period in the 60s and 70s. He's the MP for Consett, which currently includes part of the constituency that our friend who was a lobbyist for the Israel movement has found himself imposed in the north of Durham. And David Watkins says this. He talks in the Parliamentary Labour Party of Zionist infiltration. And he said there were some people from the earliest days who were opposed to Israel. And one of them who opposed it was a man called T.S.B. Williams, MP, a doctor and ex-soldier with experience in the Middle East. And he spoke out powerfully against this. And in the early period of Israel's existence, it appears there were several people in the Labour Party in Parliament who had served in the Second World War and had seen for themselves some of the realities in the creation of Israel and spoke out at that time about it. But David Watkins goes on to say, even in those days, and he's talking about the 60s and 70s, those Labour MPs who stood up and spoke about it were heavily attacked in a profound way. One woman MP, he said, was having excreta posted through her letterbox, and the lobby was deliberately setting her constituency party at odds with each other over the issue of Israel. And at that time, of course, we're living through the beginning or the early years of the Cold War, and that, I think, helps us move towards the other theme of your book, or part theme of your book, was the other side of the Atlantic and the lobby there and the power of that lobby. I briefly, in the late 1970s, had a quite curious experience. I was working for the Washington Post in DC and working with several colleagues at the time when the issue was to do Sharansky and the release of Jews in the Soviet Union. And one of my colleagues, who was Ben Bradley's lover at the time and later wife, had written a long feature about doe-eyed Mrs. Sharansky. And this led to a conversation in the newsroom about Israel. And completely out of the blue, I think I was the only Englishman working there at the time, one of my colleagues, who until then had been perfectly jovial and genial, suddenly turned to me and said, "My people don't like your people very much." And I didn't understand what she meant. And it took one of my colleagues to say, when we went to the pub in the break, and she said, "Well, you know, Mary's absolutely nuts about Israel, don't you?" And it was at that time I began to get some understanding of the extent of the lobby's influence. So could you talk a bit about that, Ilan, how that developed and how the tactics that were used to dispose of Jeremy Corbyn here had been well tried in the United States by the Israel lobby decades before. William Fulbright, you know the full list of many of these people. How did that develop, and what was the motivation and the engine that drove that within the United States towards its foreign policy?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the American Jewish community begins to be Zionized, so to speak, in a significant way only after the First World War. And a very important factor that allows it to become more and more effective and popular is actually the Zionist lobby in Britain that guided the first American Zionist and was very helpful in creating the infrastructure that later on would become AIPAC. In fact, British Zionist advocates in Britain already in 1900 used the most important method that the AIPAC would use later on, which was to accompany politicians at the very early stages of their career, offer them help so that they would be loyal at the time to the Zionist idea, later to Israel, with a threat in a way that if they don't support the policies that the Zionist movement wants or Israel, they might move their support, the lobby would move its support to their rivals. So the idea was actually conceived in Britain. Now, it was particularly after the Second World War that we begin to see the mushrooming of American Zionist groups that are concerned, I would say, with two things which are sometimes forgotten. One, there was no much willingness among certain sections of the American Jewish community to receive large number of Jewish refugees from Europe. Without admitting it, for some of them, supporting the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was diverting a stream of Jews to America into Palestine. Secondly, it took them sometimes to clear a certain conundrum, and once it was cleared or solved, they became very supportive of the idea of Israel, and that was the conundrum of dual loyalty. And Dutch Brandeis was very famous. He's the one who solved it for the American Jewish community. Because if you define Judaism as nationalism, as Zionism does, then as an American Jew, you have a dual nationality. And Brandeis said, no. And he wrote a lot about it. And then it became the kind of the guideline for the Zionist movement in their explanation to the American public why supporting Zionism is not about dual nationality. He said, Judaism is nationalism in certain places, but not in the United States. It is nationalism, particularly in Palestine, but also in some parts of Eastern Europe. And once that was solved, it was easy to say, yes, you could kind of support the state of Israel as a Jew without being accused of dual loyalty. And what I think happened, and this is what the book is trying to argue, that the people who were the first lobbies, including the ones who built AIPAC in the early 1950s, understood very well the American lobby system and the way American politics works, especially the connection, as we can see today, between power and money, power and capital in the United States. The moment they understood it, they became powerful to such an extent that it didn't always matter, I claim in the book, whether they were working on behalf of Israel or not. They became a body that was interested in its own power, in its own deterrence. And some of its most brutal actions against people it didn't like were not an implementation of a policy from Israel. These were not requests from Israel, attack this particular politician because he's not friendly to Israel. No, they took their own initiatives when they thought that there were people who are undermining the image that AIPAC has on Capitol Hill as the strongest and the most fearsome lobby on Hill. And this was the fate of Fulbright. Senator Fulbright, who in 1962 was the chair of the Foreign Committee of the Senate. In 1962, he was probably the strongest American politician. And he was not so much interested in American policy towards Israel, although he was critical about it as well. He was worried about the power of AIPAC as the lobby. And he understood that part of the power is because it violates American laws and regulation of lobbying for a foreign country. And he wanted to make sure that it is defined as a foreign agent, which allows the administration to monitor its actions. And therefore, he prepared a huge report, which showed that AIPAC was recruiting money in America, supposedly for poor people in Israel, but the money never went to Israel. It went very quickly into the coffers of AIPAC itself. He was about to convince President Kennedy to have a public meeting about it in the Senate, but the lobby was already strong enough to persuade Kennedy that the meeting would be closed and that the report would not be published. He leaked the report to Newsweek, and then he became arch enemy of AIPAC. And it took them between 1962 to 1974 to totally destroy the political career of the strongest American politician. This was a deterrence. This was an important success. You needed to do very little later on when it came to other politicians. One young American politician who joined the Foreign Affairs Committee in 1974, in the last days of Fulbright, before he really fell and lost his career, was a young senator named Joe Biden. And there's no doubt in my mind that what the show that he saw, that he watched, how the strongest politician in America is destroyed, was engraved in his mind. I can see connection between that and his declaration in October 2023, I'm a Zionist president. There is a connection there. So yes, AIPAC was a much more effective, a much more formidable version of the pro-Zionist lobby in Britain. The nature of British politics is not that easy to manipulate compared to the nature of American politics, and it became an organization that sought power for the sake of power, not always in order to serve Israel's interest, but it made sure that by inertia, the most junior politician in America and the most senior politician in America don't even have to be told what kind of behavior they have to adopt when they are asked to vote or make decisions that pertain to issues that concern Israel.
Whilst this is going on in the United States, Ilan, Harold Wilson is the Prime Minister in Britain, who has something of a reputation from the left of the Labour Party of not joining the Americans in Vietnam, but he was a very strong supporter of Israel. What's that all about? Where did that come from?
Yes, Harold Wilson himself, who wrote a book about his connection to Israel, claims that it has to do with his upbringing, religious upbringing, traditional upbringing, but he also claims that it was the outcome of studying the reality in Israel and Palestine. And what is really surprising that this very educated person, a man of the world, really, he was not someone who was just interested in domestic politics. He had a wide perspective and usually supported important struggles. For example, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. He became connected to the labor friends of Israel that were able to use something in his worldview or upbringing to blind him in many ways to a reality that, especially after 1967, became even clearer, the reality of occupation and oppression. His view was so absurd that actually he saw the ANC and the Zionist movement in the same light. At the time that the decolonized world that began to be represented in the United Nations made exactly the opposite equation. Equated apartheid South Africa with Israel, not the ANC. He didn't object, that this probably he didn't know, that a forest that was planted in his honor was actually a Jewish National Fund forest spreading over the ruins of 5 villages that were destroyed in 1948. He believed that he was doing this as a kind of a fusion of a logical, realistic analysis with moral values. I think he was very well manipulated by the lobby. Again, he still was, to my mind, from these milieu of labor politicians that racism was part of the worldview, despite their subscription to universal values and so on. It takes time to get rid of racism after you're part of an empire that colonizes and oppresses. And I suppose that worked very well in Israel's favor when it needed to recruit allies like him. I'm always interested in historians, whether people in similar position or parallel positions who had similar access to the reality were all thinking the same way, and we know they didn't. So it's a very interesting question why some other people who were no less important in Britain did not, we're not that blind, we're not that mesmerized by the Israeli propaganda that began to be truly tested given the realities of the ground. I say especially after 1967, 5, 6 years into the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the Americans used to have a term for people like this. They call them POPs, progressive except on Palestine. And that is an interesting phenomenon that provides Israel exceptional immunity from people that you would have expected to be far more critical, given the very clear evidence of the oppression and colonization.
One of the interesting things to me during the Wilson years, Ilan, his appointment of Michael Foot's older brother as the British representative to the UN, his name was Hugh Foot, he became Lord Caradon, and was a key figure at the UN in the passage of Resolution 242, that Wilson had this view about Israel, but at the same time appointed Hugh Foot, who was a former colonial civil servant. He told me once that in Nablus, there's a place named after him when he was a junior colonial officer called Nablus Square, Foot Square in Nablus. I never got to check that when I was last in Nablus, it's an interesting thing. But if we move on from the Wilson era here, past Michael Foot to Neil Kinnock, who I did work with for a while at the Labour Party, and tell me if this is a misreading as you see it. It seemed to me that Kinnock was quite a radical force. He certainly came from the left. He was a Tribunite. He supported the candidature of Michael Foot for the leader of the Labour Party. But he was also quietly, I think, a strong Zionist. And the impression I formed through seeing him and particularly his media operation was he was heavily reliant during the time he was leader, facing the opposition of Murdoch and the Sun, on Robert Maxwell, who, owning the Mirror Group, was his one source of support. And with Maxwell, of course, came Alistair Campbell, whose career Maxwell had rescued from difficult times. Is that part of it, or was Kinnock never really a radical in the way that some people thought he was? He was always supportive of the Zionist project in some way.
It depends how we define radicalism. I suppose today a radical who supports the state of Israel would be a bit like a radical supporting apartheid South Africa during the heydays of apartheid. But in those days, it was possible. It was possible to regard yourself and being regarded by others as radical or very much on the left of the Labour Party, and yet being a staunch supporter of the state of Israel. This was a great success of the advocacy and lobbying for Israel, that this, what to me looks like an irrational, I would say even an immoral equation, looked very normal and moral to people like him and people around him. But I think it also exposes something that we tend to underestimate. The word lobby sometimes may seem a more diffused kind of human activity, or a kind of a low-key human activity of advocacy here and there. This is not true. This is a very efficient, well-organized, well-oiled organization that works 24 hours a day for a cause and identifies connections between power, money, media, discourse, knowledge production in universities, causes that might seem attractive to people. Look later on how the Israeli lobby connected itself to LBGT interest, or try to with other minority groups. It doesn't cease for a moment. It's very important to understand it, and therefore, if they can connect even conflicting interests between a mogul of the press and a failing candidate for prime minister, they would interfere. They would interfere. The most important example I give in my book is the connections that Tony Blair built when it was not clear whether the trade unions are going to support his candidacy, which also meant a financial problem for Tony Blair before he elected. And I described the meetings in the Israeli embassy, which were very, very important. By the way, that's the reason that Amazon UK is not selling my book, because I think they don't admit it, but I think that's, for some reason, Amazon US doesn't care. I think in America that looks there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe it's a good sign that some British people think that no, that's a bit too much. But yes, they were very. They didn't always succeed, but they were very, very aware of these connections, and it was very tactical. They didn't kind of probe into the morality of the person, the other interests of that individual or group. If you could build an alliance that would bring someone to a position of power that can serve the state of Israel, then we will be part of it. So I do think it's a fair analysis of the Neil Kinnock Maxwell connection that you mentioned here.
Going from Kinnock via John Smith, whose foreign policy advisor is now, I think, the chair of Labour Friends of Israel in the Lords, Baroness Ramsey, who's a career civil servant, but actually an MI6 case officer. And we move on to Blair. And you say in your book that you think it would be very unlikely that New Labour would have happened without the finances that were made available to Tony Blair after John Smith's death. Could you expand on that a little, please, Ilan?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the TUC were not there to help, and there was need for funding for the campaign. I'm not saying that the funding of the campaign is responsible for New Labour. I mean, New Labour is Tony Blair's idea, for good or for worse. But it definitely was a very important factor in helping him to be elected as the candidate, as the chair of the party, and then later on as the prime minister. This was a very important connection, because he needed a kind of a private funding that had quite a lot of Anglo-Jewish affluent members of society contributing to it. Not only they, but they were, I think, the most important contributors. And they were members of the lobby. I mean, it's not the Jewish thing. It's the fact that these were people who were part of the pro-Israeli lobby. It was far more important than their religious identity.
Exactly.
And you can never, as an historian, prove the connection between these contribution and a certain policy that Blair would take later as a prime minister. You can't. These things are never that simple. You can just, as I do in the book, display the facts and ask people whether they see some connections the visits that were paid by Israel for Tony Blair when he was still a candidate. Look at the policies. I think he gets off a bit because one of the first thing he does as a prime minister is be involved in the Oslo Accord. So you could say, I mean, so what's wrong? I mean, here you had a British prime minister involved in a peace process. So that was not an anti-Palestinian necessarily, an anti-Palestinian policy. But that depends how we understand the Oslo Accord, of course, and how we understand Britain's role in it, and so on. Yes.
Could you say in the final few minutes before we get to the Q&A, Ilan, we've moved on to Starmer and his position and the financing of his leadership campaign and subsequently. And what does that mean when we think about domestic British politics and democracy? We've seen what's happened to Asa Winstanley, Craig Murray, various other people who have raised serious questions about what's going on with British policy in relation to West Asia. Where are we now? I mean, is the lobby a threat to democracy? And if it is, what can we do about it?
Well, first of all, I should say the decision of Britain to be where it is today, namely, the Labour Party. Let's not talk about Britain. Let's talk about the current Labour Party. The decision of, that's my take, the decision of the current Labour Party not to do anything against the genocide in Gaza, to only take symbolic acts which really are not going to stop the Israeli actions on the ground, not right now, and those, unfortunately, that are planning in the future. That particular policy is not just the outcome of an effective lobbying. It is a matrix of factors that we need to unpack if we would like to believe that one day British policy would be different. One of them is, of course, a fruit of more than 100 years of lobbying for Zionism in Britain. It becomes part of the inertia of being a politician to support Israel. Second one, the intimidation by the lobby of anyone who dares to stand in the way. Nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite, and it can have, as we know, can have serious repercussions for one's political career, even to one's job. However, there are other issues there, which are very important, and one of them is the essence of politics. The gap between what the electorates in Britain would have liked British policy to be towards Palestine and the actual policy becomes wider and wider as we go through the years. It seems that, and that includes the Labour Party, the politicians see the electorate as a power base for being elected and not as a group of people who has concerns that have to be addressed and dealt with. And this is all over the globe, and especially in the global north. We can see it now more powerfully than ever before. And the more, it's very clear to me that the more the policies, or the more the politicians would more authentically represent people's real concerns, not just on Palestine, on poverty, on global warming, on immigration, and not just the people who are, for whatever reasons, oppose immigration, but the moral consciences of many other people about how to treat life seekers and people who are unfortunate to be where they are. The more this will be represented in the policies from above, the more the British policy towards Palestine and Israel will change. So I think the lobby is successful as long as politics is done the way it is done today. And I don't want to sound, and with this I would end, I don't want to sound disparaging. I'm not impressed by the level of the politicians we have. I don't remember a period in history where politicians looked so mediocre, so self-centered, so less interested in the real problems of people.
Mhm.
And therefore, I think that works well for the lobby. It works well for Israel. It works well for monarchies and dictatorial authoritative regime in West Asia as well. And we just would hope that a certain revolution will occur in which politics represents more authentically what people want. And if this would happen, I'm sure that Palestine and the Palestinians would benefit from such a transformation. We saw a glimpse of it in the French elections.
Mhm.
I was there in the celebration of the win of the left. Every second person was waving the Palestine flag. The elections in France were not about Palestine, but everyone who won on the
Mhm.
left waved the Palestinian flag, and that tells you something. And I think that's the connection.
Thanks, Ilan. Give yourself a brief break. We have three people who have indicated that they want to ask questions. Now, to remind everybody that we are recording this, so if for any reason you don't wish to be seen in the recording, then probably a good idea that you don't make your presence felt now. But what I'd like to do, Ilan, is to maybe take 3 questions initially,
Okay.
and for you to answer them all. So in this order, we have Ben and Colin and Dave. So Ben, if you're unmuted or if you can unmute yourself, could you fire away, please?
I believe I've unmuted myself successfully.
Indeed, you have.
Thank you. May I greatly welcome Professor Dr. Ilan Pappé, an inspiration to all of us. I'm afraid I have rather a bundle of comments, but a question, maybe a bit marginal. Tell us a bit about the murder by Israel of the sailors of the USS Liberty. Has not even attained the level of openness eventually allowed to the US Admiral and General on Hawaii, which has taken 80 years to surface. There's a conspiracy for you. Quite close to the American Joint Distribution Committee family in the early and mid-60s. The execution, I'd call it that, of Charlie Jordan, who was found drowned in the center of Prague in 1967, made quite an impression on them, and I'd be interested if you've any knowledge about that. Ernie Bevin moved from the extreme left to the serious right, tactlessly pointed out to American politicians thought there were too many Jews in New York, let alone the rest of the country. And lastly, just a little anecdote about Northern Durham. I was quite close to a former Northwest Durham MP, Mark Hughes, who agreed with me about Northern Ireland, but that's a different issue. And I can assure you that from an impeccable source on what is now called North Durham, in the Gusto restaurant on the 21st of September of this year, I heard an anecdote from the General Committee of that CLP when a concern for the poor Palestinian people was raised. The answer came from one of the traditional Biners delegates who said, I won't do the accent, sorry about that. If you're so concerned about Palestine, why don't you go and live there?
Thanks, Ben. Colin?
End of.
Thank you. Colin?
Yes, thank you, Ilan, for your wonderful insights. I'd like to ask about the promotion of the two-state solution. promoted by the Jewish Labour movement on its banners and in its literature, promoted by Keir Starmer at the end of every comment on the area, as if it was some kind of magical solution that is waiting to be plucked from the tree, so to speak. Is it ignorance or profound insincerity that people talk now about the two-state solution? And what is the, if you have any knowledge of the inside thinking of these various lobbies, are they promoting it as some kind of cover? Because I do believe that the only solution that is going to be there is the apartheid state of the Greater Israel.
Thanks, Colin. Dave, and I appreciate all your brevity. We have a lot of people who want to come in, and we've about 25 minutes left. So, Dave, please.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Good. I'm chair of Jewish Network for Palestine, which I'm very grateful that Ilan is a patron of. I was always fascinated to listen to Ilan, and the way he described, we weren't interested in the area for the 200 years up to the end of the 19th century. And I'm wondering, therefore, would he agree the reasons why are a mixture of it coinciding at the end of the 19th century with East European Jewish immigration into the West. It also coincided with the Navy switching from coal to oil. And finally, the growing nationalism in India at that time, which was the jewel in the crown of the empire. Be interested to know his thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
Ilan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by what I don't know, the incident in Prague. I'm sorry, but I will look into it. But I do know something about the SS Liberty, which was the main question. For those who don't know, I'm sure most of us do know that the SS Liberty was an intelligence ship of the American Navy that the Israeli Air Force hit on the 8th of June 1967, killing quite a large number of people there. The documents that were released under the Act of Freedom of Information in the United States themselves are still not enough for us to complete the puzzle. But they do give us a certain indication of what happened there. One thing is that this particular vessel was involved in eavesdropping, so to speak. That is, they were intercepting communications between various armies, inside various armies in the area, the Egyptian, the Israeli, the Jordanian, and so on. And it was definitely listening to a communication in the Israeli army about an act of killing Egyptian and Egyptian prisoners of war, or some sort of other act that was probably a war crime. We are not even clear about that entirely. So one version is that the attack was connected to realization that this is being exposed. Another one is that altogether there was no wish for the American to listen to the Israeli military communication. Of course, there is the Israeli claim of a mistaken identity, which is a bit bizarre because the American flag was flying very clearly on the vessel. The second question was about what was it about? I should have written down. Do you remember, John? Just give me a clue.
Two-state solution.
Yeah, the two-state thing.
There was a two-state. There was a no. That was the third question.
Okay.
That was the third question.
Okay. Well, do you want to deal with that one, and then we can
I will
come
deal
back.
with that, and maybe yes,
We can come back to the other one.
I rely so much on my memory, but I should stop doing this because usually 3 questions I can easily remember. It will come back to me. Anyway, about the two-state solution. That's a very important point. And the point there is that part of what Britain, the United States, and the EU are talking about with some Arab countries as well, it's called the day after. The day after Gaza, which hasn't happened yet. The day is not after. And quite surprisingly, as if nothing of significance has happened in the last year, they are repeating the main guidelines for a solution that I would call are the guidelines of the peace orthodoxy in the case of of Israel and Palestine. The peace orthodoxy are the guidelines for a solution that Britain and the United States, for a certain period also Russia and other countries, were putting forward as the only way forward, namely a small autonomous Palestinian state in part of the West Bank, and the one that has an enclave in Gaza as well, without a proper sovereignty, without proper army and economy, without a proper capital, and with no real solution for the Palestinian refugee problem. And in return for a declaration by the Palestinians that the conflict is over, and that should encourage other Arab states to normalize relationship with Israel. This is still the position of the British Foreign Ministry, Foreign Office. Always was the position of the Foreign Office since 1967. Of course, there's a difference when that position was adopted when not one Jewish settlers was colonizing the West Bank in June 1967, and the reality is now with 700,000 Jewish settlers there. I think that this is a non-starter for any change in the reality on the ground. This is a conversation that has no relevance to what goes on. And sometimes you would think that they think they know about another Palestine and Israel, which I'm not aware of. It's very sad to see the British diplomats and certainly knowledgeable people who assist them as advisors and consultants in Chatham House and so on, still sticking to an idea that has no connection to reality, and refusing to admit that they were wrong all these years by thinking that Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East, adhering to values of democracy, and that the Palestinians were the side that is missing opportunities for a genuine and generous Israeli concession. You would have thought that by now they would understand that they're dealing with an apartheid state, a settler colonial project, and then we're not seeking peace. We're seeking decolonization of an ongoing colonialist project. And this is something which is very difficult to absorb. I can understand it. The language itself sounds alien to most of these British policymakers, but we have to be aware that without this change in the disc, without this change of vocabulary and dictionary, Israel would be able to continue to do what it's doing, but it also is digging its own hole by its own actions. So one day, even British diplomats or policymakers would have to adopt a different ideas about what should be the real path towards reconciliation and liberation in Palestine.
And the third question, Ilan, was from Dave, which related to British foreign policy, the transition from coal to oil, and how, amongst other things.
Yes. I want to say something about it. First of all, you're absolutely right in connecting the British or important people in the British policy-making structure, who, and the most important of them was Lord Arthur Balfour, who wanted to support the idea of a Jewish state in order to stop the flow of poor Jews coming from Romania and Russia into Britain, especially being suspect of harboring socialist and Bolshevik ideas. So definitely, this is a very important factor, deafening in influencing someone like Arthur Balfour to support the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. As for the change from coal to oil, that was the one problem for the Zionist lobby. The change from coal to oil and the beginning of problems of national uprisings in India did not necessitate control of Palestine. For that, you needed Egypt and you needed Iraq. You didn't need Palestine. That's why, still in 1916, Britain is still thinking whether maybe Palestine should be jointly controlled with France. What really convinced them that Palestine is connected to these strategic interests was the fact that that Palestine was used twice or three times to counterattacks by the Turkish army. And that convinced leading generals in the British Army that actually Palestine could be a buffer zone from anyone coming from the north and trying to extract the Suez Canal from Britain.
Right. We've got time for another 4 questions, I think. 90 minutes. 90 minutes would be a long session for you, Ilan, fairly intense. So we have Rika, Jonathan, Neera, and Penny. If we could take them one after the other, if you could sum those up at the end, and I'll try and take a note of what they say, just in case your memory slips on one or two of them. So
Yes,
please, Rika, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ilan. I've learned a lot. And some of the thoughts that you've expressed so well have occurred in a very rudimentary form in my own mind. I really appreciate the time you put into it. The question is, in your view, to what extent does the current official Israeli project, for want of a better phrase, benefit or not from the increasing blatant expression of racism of the likes of Tommy Robinson and his followers in the United Kingdom?
Thank you. Jonathan?
Sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you, Ilan. Your account sort of stopped with Gordon Brown, and things have happened since then. Maybe there's more in the book, and I'm looking forward to getting it. But you could see it as a weakness, possibly, of the lobby that the wrong Miliband got elected leader in 2015, and certainly that Jeremy Corbyn got elected. Sorry, I got the wrong date. 2010, 2015. Are these signs that there are weaknesses in the lobby? Though clearly it came back roaring in to recover the situation. But are there weaknesses that we can learn about from those experiences that might be exploited later? Thank you.
Thanks for your brevity, Jonathan. Neera.
Hi, Ilan. Thank you very much for all these fascinating things about the two states. I think it's not just the West. I think the whole legal structure of the UN discourse is bound by this two-state solution, and I think this is a bigger issue. But the two questions I wanted to ask: one, you mentioned Christianity in the past, but some say that the role of Christian evangelists is even more important than of AIPAC in support of Israel, and I wanted to ask what you think about it. And second, I wanted to ask, what do you think, because I've heard that you and others, and in some extent me as well, thinks that since the last year war is probably in some way the beginning of the end of the Zionist project, and I wonder what you think about that.
Thanks. And Penny.
John, could I just intercede? I've been unable to put my electronic hand up. I don't know if you can squeeze me in.
We'll see at the end.
Okay.
Let's give precedence to the ones who've managed to get their hand up first. Penny, and then if we can squeeze you in at the end, Glyn, we will. Penny, please.
Ilan, I was interested that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk Lawrence of Arabia. What credence do you actually give to the possibility that is being, what can I say, touted, that his motorcycle accident was no accident?
Fine. And Glyn, quickly then, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Ilan. The power of the lobby is such that it can be used to obscure the fact that Israel plays this role in American foreign policy, cutting with the grain, with the flow, and that therefore the lobby, Israel has an area of flexibility within those parameters of long-term American interest in using Israel as a powerful tool implementing its control of the Middle East, North Africa region.
Fine, thanks. Ilan.
Yeah. First, the connection with the EDL or let's widen it and talk about the connection with the fascist right all over Europe, and not just in Europe, you know. Different parts of the global south are also now ruled in India and were ruled in Brazil by similar personality, a mixture of populism with right-wing politics. It's interesting how you want one to judge it. I judge it as the only truthful alliance that Israel would be able to build in the future. And namely, these are the only natural allies Israel would have, the way it is developing. And I would say something more about it when I answer one of Nira's question. But I would say that the alliance, you can call it global Israel, the alliance that gives immunity to Israel, that gives it exceptionalism, is made of different members. It used to have very important members from social democratic parties, social democratic international conferences. It still has support from global North countries and OECD countries, but the elements in those countries that are immune to what becomes more and more difficult to protect as a past supporter of Israel are exactly these fascist right-wing, mostly anti-Semitic, one should say, political movements and personalities. In the short run, it means that their counterparts in Israel could have an international network, even if some of its traditional supporters are gone. In the long run, I think it would contribute to the making of Israel as a pariah state, as a rogue state, and would increase the isolation of Israel in international community. As for the question, a very good question about Corbyn, and before that, anyone else who made was successful despite of the lobby, and yet paid a very high price because of the lobby. And there's no better example than Jeremy Corbyn for that. Yes, I think, but that's the historian in me. I don't see events like this as events that had a closure or that they are one-off event. I see them as structures. And the structure that I see here is the lobby losing its ability to prevent someone from becoming a candidate for the leadership of the Labour Party. Yes, they're still powerful enough to bring down that leader, connecting themselves with other non-socialist factors in the Labour Party to do that, but they already failed in preventing the leadership contest. And they would fail much worse in the next attempt. I think that's the projection. That's the trajectory. And the trajectory, the only problem with that trajectory is that it's too slow for the people of Palestine. Yeah. The pace of destruction in Palestine is much faster than the pace of the change. And there is a change in the way political systems react to the Israeli brutality on the ground. The role of Zionism, Zionist Christians today that Nira asked about. Yes, definitely. I think that because of the dramatic change in the Jewish community in the United States, especially among young Jews, that begin to jettison the idea that their collective Jewish identity has to be connected to Zionism, and finding other ways of expressing their collectivity, in some cases by showing solidarity actually with the Palestinians. This process has weakened AIPAC, has weakened the pro-Jewish lobby, and left the Christian Zionists, who are far more pious, if you want, in their support for Israel as a religious imperative, as the only stronger element in the lobby. Because also and this relates, I think, to the last question that was asked. It's related to that question, because the other kind of, the American support for Israel lies on a three-leg stool, so to speak, or three pillars, or three legs of whatever metaphor I have now. This late in the evening, it has three pillars, and one of them is the Jewish lobby, one is the Christian Zionist lobby, and the one is the military-industrial complex that benefits from their relationship with Israel, and that relates to the last question. Whether the problem for Israel is that in order to sustain what these people would think is the American national interests, namely to have the energy sources in the Middle East under control, to have influence in West Asia and so on, I'm not sure that in their eyes, Israel is now an asset. I think they see Israel as a liability after last year, and they think that people in, the rulers of the Arab world, especially in monarchies and princedom, are far more reliable allies for the capitalist military-industrial complex than Israel is. Israel is not a bonanza anymore. Look at the reports of the SP and Moody about the Israeli economy. And this leads to the other question of Nira at the beginning. Yes, I do share those with people who, from within Israel, can see something that the media in the West, especially in Britain, does not report at all. Don't know how much are you aware of this, Nira. There is this disintegration of the state. Services are not functioning. People don't believe in the army, contrary to what the Israeli media is trying to say. People don't believe that the army can defend them. There is no common base between the religious Jews and the secular Jews. These are two different states. I call one of them state of Judea and one of them state of Israel. And the state of Judea is swallowing the state of Israel. And 700,000 of the state of Israel have already left the joint state of Israel and Judea. They have left, and many more are on the way out. The economy is crumbling. The international standing, despite of the lobby and everything else, is deteriorating. And they are still facing something that is not happening, but might happen, a very different young Palestinian generation, far more assertive, far more educated, far more united, far more able to overcome the dissent and factionalism of the present state of the Palestinian politics. You use that all together, you see a disintegration of a state, which is not surprising. Israel is located in the Eastern Mediterranean that is full of disintegrating failed states. Because all these states, including Israel, were created by colonialist powers after the First World War on the basis of the Westphalian European nation-state model that does not fit the realities in Eastern Mediterranean. And this is collapsing in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, and not only in Israel. So Israel is part of the Middle East despite the dreams of Israelis or their assertion that they are part of Europe. Lawrence of Arabia's death, I looked into it as much as I could in the days I was in Oxford and so on, some private collections. I couldn't, I think he was a reckless motorcyclist. But I'm willing to accept everything, but I just need to see the evidence. So I think this more or less, John, concludes my my replies. I do apologize if I had some constructive amnesia of some of the points, but it's also age and tiredness. Yes.
No, thank you very much, Ilan. Most people who are listening don't know that Ilan actually joined us a good half hour before the rest of you did. So he's well over 2 hours into this time, and it only falls to me. I mean, he's made this useful, I think, distinction between optimism and hope. And dismisses optimism in the present situation, but hangs on to hope. If you've any thought on that before we wrap up, Ilan, I'd be grateful.
Yes, I agree. I like the distinction because this is the darkest hour in the history of modern Palestine. And unfortunately, that hour is not over. I believe that 2025 would be as bad, if not worse, than 2024. However, it is, and I say it as an analyst, as an historian, and not just, this is not a wishful thinking of an activist. It is part of a process that has a light in the end of the tunnel. And that light is something that has to be grasped, has to be exploited by the Palestinian national movement. They're the only ones who can do that. Because collapse of a state, a disintegration of a state, can create a chaos and void that can continue for a very long time. Look at Syria and Libya. In order to fill the void, in order to shorten the transition from this collapse that, to my mind, is pending, into a better life for everyone, Jews and Arabs, between the river and the sea, based on models that have much more to do with pre-1948 Palestine, when Jews, Muslim, and Christian lived together, than ideas coming from Europe about how conflict resolution looked like. When this will be possible, then I think we will look back at this period as a very terrible period, but as a corridor leading for a much more hopeful and better years to come that would lead to the liberation of Palestine, its freedom, and hopefully for reconciliation on a genuine kind between Jews and Arabs, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Ivan, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. We're grateful for your time and the preparation that you put in beforehand to allow us to continue this in a thoughtful and provocative way. We thank you for your time, and thank you very much to all of those who've joined for this meeting, particularly those, I mean, there are several I know who've actually joined JVL to be able to be here for this meeting. And we're grateful to them and for whatever energies they're able to put in. There are many demands on our time in these difficult times, but we're grateful for you joining us. We hope you found it a worthwhile gathering. And thank you, Ilan, again for tonight and for all your work and what we feel sure will be coming forth in the future. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.